there is more going on up there, and the way we process information changes as we age. So normal age-related memory changes are really more about how we're processing information and how our brains work well, versus with dementia, again, depending on what type of dementia it is, there's going to be a different reason that you're having issues with that memory.
Hey y'all, this is Kosta, and today I'm here with my guest, Kyrié Carpenter, co-founder of the Anti-Ageism Clearinghouse, author of Healing Dementia, an in-depth psychological look at the phenomenon of cognitive change, and experienced career coach with a demonstrated history of working in the mental health care industry. Today we're talking about the myths and misconceptions of dementia. I know this might seem ironic for a podcast about dementia, but will you briefly explain what dementia is and what causes it?
Absolutely, yeah. So first, I feel like it's really helpful to understand the words we're doing. So etymologically, dementia means out of mind. And now actually in diagnosis, we're not even using dementia anymore. So in psychology, there's a big book called the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, that is where we have all of our different psychological diagnoses. And dementia is currently called neurocognitive disorder in that book. And I think that that name is more helpful because it actually breaks it down. So neuro, that just means something going on with our brain. Cognitive is a fancy way of saying thinking, and disorder is, the opposite of order. So effectively, things aren't functioning the way that they have previously. Something's going on in a new way. So that's how I like to think of dementia. And, roughly it is a symptom set, which is really interesting to know. So some dementias, we know what quote unquote causes them. They can be, when we're talking about that, we're thinking of there can be dementia related to a vascular event. So you have some sort of thing that happens with your blood, some sort of blood clot in the brain, parts of the brain, lose blood. We know then we have a dementia from that. Other dementias are a little less clear. We could talk about that for a long time, but all of that to say, when we're diagnosing dementia, we're looking at that cognition, how we think, and we're wanting to see it changing in at least two ways. So the DSM, again, breaks down 6 ways that our brain works. And if we see major changes in at least 2 of those, we're going to give a diagnosis of dementia. So this is really important to know that dementia isn't like COVID, where it's a virus that we can see and that we can work on fighting. That's not what we're talking about. We're actually talking about an experience, a phenomenon, a symptom set. And so when we're thinking about those different ways that our brain changes, one aspect of it is memory. Other ones are executive functioning, which is a way of just saying like how we work. We're looking at language, we're looking at social cues. And there's these different domains of cognition that we're looking at. And we need to, again, see change in 2 or more of them before even giving a diagnosis.
But what causes these diagnoses? Like, they say it's plaque on the brain or something like that, but maybe there's a better explanation.
Yeah, so then it's helpful to realize that dementia is an umbrella term, again, for like saying the way that you're thinking has changed in at least 2 of these ways. And then underneath that, there's lots of types of dementia. The most famous of which is Alzheimer's. There's also Lewy body. So when we're talking about Alzheimer's, that's where you hear plaques and tangles, and those are coming in. And to be perfectly honest, emerging research is showing us that there's correlation, but the causation gets a little bit confusing with Alzheimer's.
Interesting.
There's an amazing study called the Nun Study that's still in process, where an entire group of nuns donated their brains to science, and they're able to do the first double-blind study on giving people cognitive tests while they're alive to measure these changes and give diagnoses of dementia, but then also do the brain biopsy looking for the plaques and tangles. And interestingly, everyone who had the plaques, everyone who had a dementia diagnosis, I want to say this right, did have the plaques and tangles, but not everyone who had plaques and tangles exhibited symptoms of dementia in their lifetime. So that tells us the story is more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said vascular event, and I'm thinking that you were, in layman's terms, you meant stroke, right?
Yep, a stroke, or like mini strokes as they'll be called, anything that's disrupting blood flow to the brain. So there's over 10 different types of dementia. There's Lewy body dementia, which is another, a Lewy body in the brain. There's over 10 types of dementia, which is really important to know that Alzheimer's and dementia are not synonyms.
Yeah.
And
honestly,
that, again, it's not a disease, yeah.
Right. I mean, and I hear a lot of people make that assumption all the time, and I have to correct them that they're not the exact same thing. I will ask you later on in the show about the prescription. It's called Aduhelm. It's covered by Medicare. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that because, like you were talking about in terms of a cure, obviously that's what everybody wants, whether it's dementia, cancer, AIDS, what have you. But dementia, it's interesting the distinction that you make when you say it's not a virus. You can't isolate it, say, there it is, we got to treat that, right?
Yep.
So
yeah, and there's amazing, if people are interested in that idea more, sort of don't take my word for it.
Right.
There's two amazing thinkers. Dr. Peter Whitehouse wrote about the Alzheimer's myth, so sort of this myth that it is this disease that we can cure simply, and we just don't know enough yet. And also Margaret Locke wrote The Alzheimer's Conundrum, which really goes into very academic, deep detail into why dementia really is more of a phenomenon than a disease is a more accurate descriptor.
Oh, wow. I like that. That's a very interesting description. How does dementia differ from normal aging and memory loss? And how do you respond to the myth that dementia is a normal part of aging?
Mm-hmm. So changes in memory, both short and long term, are one of those symptoms of dementia I was mentioning that you have to have at least two of. So that's where I guess the Venn diagram overlaps, if you will, that there are changes in short and long-term memory that can be a component of a dementia diagnosis. And definitely a part of the experience of living with dementia is very frequently changes in memory. That being said, from the day we're born, our brain is developing, and then 25 to 28, we know it's pretty much fully matured, and then we begin, biological aging at that point. From that point onward, we know that we get less skillful at doing really fast math and recall. This can be replicated in studies. We also become more skillful, which usually gets left out of the conversation, at noticing what could be called the gist, the story under the story, noticing patterns, noticing things like that. So that's when we hear, when a grandmother is listening to her teenage granddaughter talking about the boy she went on a date with, and the grandma just knows it's not going to work out. That's because she's heard 1,000 stories exactly like that and can find the pattern.
Yes.
And so a lot of this normal age-related memory problems, which is usually that recall, that tip of the tongue phenomenon, which I don't like using senior moment because, we didn't call it a junior moment when we were younger.
Right.
But that tip of the tongue phenomenon, those things, it's actually because there is more going on up there, and the way we process information changes as we age. So normal age-related memory changes are really more about how we're processing information and how our brains work well, versus with dementia, again, depending on what type of dementia it is, there's going to be a different reason that you're having issues with that memory.
Essentially,
does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, it does. It really does. So you may not be as quick to like you were saying, to recall, but honestly, if I could understand how the world works, I would much rather take that than being able to, do long division in my head, right?
Most of us would, which is great, right? That's a really good, when you actually realize that. So one of my mentors, Bill Thomas, says the next time you have that tip of the tongue phenomenon, just lay back and be like, that's all right. I have this superpower called gist. I need a minute to come up with the name of that restaurant from 3 weeks ago. Yeah. But let me tell you, I can see how the world works and move through it with more ease. Most of us would take that.
It's absolutely 100%. So in your experience, what is the most common misconception surrounding dementia? And how does this misinformation impact the way society views and treats individuals with a diagnosis?
Yeah, I love this question. Actually, I had the opportunity to do 2 focus groups with a bunch of folks living with dementia in Nevada, and ask them about what's the thing that annoys you most. So I feel like I can speak informed, sharing the voices of those living with dementia about this one, which is, and hands down the biggest misconception that they report is that people think that life, especially living well, ends with that dementia diagnosis. That all of a sudden you've gotten handed this diagnosis and you're no longer a person. Your personhood is sort of ripped away from you. Now things are done to you. You're talked at. And also just that it's There's, of course, extreme challenges to living with cognitive change, to supporting someone living with cognitive change. I never want to deny that. There also are beautiful moments that can happen, ways to live well, ways to live with less suffering. And I feel like that's the biggest misconception, is that it's, you're done. The minute you get that diagnosis, your life is over.
Yeah. Do you know the percentage of people that are actually living with dementia in the U.S.? I'm just curious.
Oh, off the top of my head, I'm not going to get it correct. It's lower than you would think.
Okay. So it's not like 10% of the population, right?
No,
it's not that
it's
high.
Actually, yeah, it's our, and not to diminish the experience of those living with it at all, but our chances of the amount of fear that we have as a culture about being diagnosed with dementia far outweighs the actual prevalence of the disease.
And you were talking about kind of how they're talked at, and I do it, and a lot of times, obviously I work in long-term care, so there's care plan meetings and things like that. Yeah. And I remember it doesn't happen as often now because everyone is working towards like a person-centered culture. But in the beginning, I remember this was a lot more prevalent. We would be in a room, and I was kind of new, so I didn't want to overstep. But I remember we were just having a conversation about the individual that we were going to be servicing and not even talking to them. Like literally, it would be like, if you have like your 3-year-old or something like that, that can't necessarily understand the conversation, but so you may or may not engage them. Right. But I'm just like, wait, she's right there. Like, why aren't we like, let's bring her in, And so I feel like, as you're talking about supporting individuals with this diagnosis, a lot of times it requires, and we're getting to a point now where technology has come to sort of help smooth out the transition, but a lot of times it does require a 24-hour commitment. Whether it may not be consistent, it could be intermittent, but still, like, you have to devote a lot of time to it. So what I end up finding through my work is people with dementia get placed in long-term care facilities, and they don't need to be there. Right. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
No, I think it gets into this, again, this concept of surplus safety, of we get so worried about something bad happening that we like almost, overdo it. And a lot of folks living with dementia will say, and a lot of folks also in the disability rights world, which, dementia is sort of this beautiful intersection of ableism and ageism, nothing about us without us. So if it's about us, like, we need to be included. And even if, language change is one of those things we talked about in a diagnosis of dementia. And in language change, there's both receptive language and expressive language. So receptive being, as you're speaking right now, do I understand you? And expressive being, now I have a thought I want to express. Can I say it in a way that you'll understand? With the experience of dementia, those change differently in every person and at different rates. So someone might not be able to verbalize their wishes, but might be able to perfectly understand that care plan conversation. And so I really challenge people to get creative about communicating and about that inclusion. Do we need to express it? Can we express it using some sort of arts or expressive arts therapy? My background is in therapy. I remember working with a woman whose family were trying to decide whether to up some medications. Those of us on the care team, we're seeing some negative side effects from it. And so we were kind of at this conundrum of, is it the risk worth the benefit? And during a watercolor class, she painted an entire sheet full of pills and then dumped the watercolor water on it. I felt like that was pretty clear communication that she didn't want more medication, even though she couldn't say that. So it's getting creative about that. What people want, and figuring out how, not saying oh, you don't speak the way you once did, now you're not included in the conversation.
Right. Right.
Looking for body language, all that kind of stuff. How can we include?
I'm curious, what's the relationship between memory loss and dementia? And is memory loss the only symptom, or are there others? Yeah,
so kind of sort of like I was saying earlier, so memory loss can exist without dementia. All of us, like I said, our brains are changing, from the time we're 28 onward. As our brains age, they're changing up how they work. And no, it is not the only symptom. So it's going to depend on the different types of dementia. So for example, frontal temporal dementia, which is one that, affects the prefrontal cortex of the brain, generally has some disinhibition that comes with it. A lot of other dementias do as well. So you're going to see some of those, sort of social changes. Again, the language changes I just mentioned. Also coordination with your body. So in some later stages, you might see folks needing a little bit of help eating. And that can either come from the message of like, that's a fork, I should use my hand to pick it up, isn't making it to the hand, or it can come from not being able to coordinate the hand. Sort of depends on how that changes. Basically, there's, again, those 6 different domains of how our brains change. And memory is one tiny piece of that.
So we were talking about the double-blind study, and obviously the disease is the phenomenon is very complex.
Yes.
I mean, like, how far are we in terms of understanding dementia at all? Are we like at the 1%? Are we just like at square one, essentially? In your opinion?
Exactly. In my opinion, yes. I know in my private conversations too, I kind of say like, if dementia was the rest of the medical industry, we'd be at the bloodletting phase and talking about humors and, we're just throwing things at it that don't work and frankly can cause a lot of harm.
Yeah.
In a really and this is what breaks my heart about dementia is we want to take care of our loved one who's living with dementia. And we want a medicine to fix it. We want to know more, but not being able to just sit in the not knowing can really cause a lot of harm, with overuse of antipsychotics, and things
absolutely.
like that.
And I've seen that happen firsthand. And literally it's like you had somebody that did suffer from a cognitive impairment, but they had their moments, but they were still like relatively normal in terms of interacting, similar to how they interacted prior to their diagnosis. But then they get prescribed, because a lot of times, and I don't know what type of dementia causes this, if it's multiple types, but they had behaviors, where they, and it could be where their inhibitions may have been lowered. They might have gotten frustrated. They caused physical injury to themselves and to others.
Yeah.
And so they got on they were prescribed antipsychotic medication, and I saw them, 3 years later, and I mean, completely different person,
There's some amazing, and I want to, I'm not a medical doctor. My background is psychotherapy, so I want to but there is a medical doctor, Dr. Al Power, talks a lot about this. He wrote a book called Dementia Beyond Drugs. Does a really great job really parsing out when someone is using a behavior as a form of communication, and that we need to be really careful not to treat for behaviors. And just even, the way antipsychotics work too is they're basically being used as sedatives. They don't treat dementia. They don't make anything better. It feels good to get a prescription for a pill because we want to be helpful, but folks would be far better off with some other medications with less side effects.
and I'm not going to go down a rabbit hole, but I do want to shine some light on this. In the IDD population, so individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, there's an entire culture built around behaviors being a form of communication.
Yes.
And like how you facilitate, how you handle someone that's experiencing a behavioral episode, and I mean trainings and programs. And so the fact that we can't correlate that to individuals who are suffering from dementia has always been rather strange for me. So, but anyway,
I would say so in that community, the IDD community, you've got the ableism. Now you've got this like ageism thrown on top of it. And we just care less about, I'm just going to be totally blatantly honest. We care less about older people in our culture than we do about younger people, in this context. And so there just isn't as much funding. There's amazing people obviously doing great work. I was really grateful the community I worked in trained us that way too. When we see a behavioral, psychological symptom, to see that as an expression of need and to get really curious about translating that need. And I can't tell you how many times there would be, whether it was violence towards themselves or others, these really scary, things, and I get people's impulse to help. But when we dug into and looked at the environment, looked at the different schedule, what was going on, we were able to actually create shifts that then the behavior ceased because we met the need.
Right. Exactly. So before we move on, what about Aduhelm? It's a drug that's now covered by Medicare. It's supposed to help treat Alzheimer's. What do you think about that? Because I don't think so either, but for some reason Medicare thinks so, and other doctors. So.
There's some awesome medical doctors in the field. Again, Al Power, Dr. Peter Whitehouse were writing really well about this from that perspective. Short cliff notes is don't do it. Money grab. Yeah. Evil big pharma. We will definitely see. Please do not put your loved ones on it. Yeah. Don't take it.
And I'll tell you, it's so expensive that premiums are going up because of it. Because I think Medicare is paying like $57,000 a year for it. So it's crazy.
Somebody's making money.
Yeah, exactly.
No, it doesn't. I would love for us to know more about dementia, to be able to understand it, to be able to work towards treatment, to be able to work towards cure. Like you said, just like with cancer, just like with AIDS, and that just isn't where we are.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about let's talk about early prevention. So if there even is something like that in the world of dementia. So generally speaking, how will early diagnosis and intervention impact the well-being and lives of those living with dementia?
Yeah, so how I'm going to unpack this is early intervention, super helpful in that everyone listening to this should be thinking about there are things we know that we can do that decrease our chances of experiencing dementia. Dr. Becca Levy out of Yale does amazing research into ageism. One of her studies was she's done quite a few around those people experiencing dementia, and found that having accurate knowledge about the aging process, so not biased, negative, ageist attitudes about aging. Then you have to go positive, just accurate, decreases your chances of experiencing dementia, including Alzheimer's, even if you have the APOE gene that says you're more likely to get it, which is amazing. So work on becoming less ageist yourself, work on your own internal bias there. That's protective against dementia. We also know from a lot of studies too that cardiovascular health. So again, I said we know vascular events can cause dementia. So the more healthy that you can keep your heart, the better. So this is all the stuff we all know to do and don't do. Exercising and eating well is also really helpful. There have been some studies that show mindfulness, meditation can be helpful. Anything that's kind of helping, the more nimble your brain is, the better it's going to be able to work around if stuff is changing. So I will say that on the early intervention side, I'm talking way before diagnosis. All of us right now, from whatever age you're at, start thinking about those things. As far as diagnosis, because we know so little about dementia, when I talk to folks about this, should we push for a diagnosis with my loved one, with myself? I always ask them for the sake of what? A diagnosis can be really helpful in going, I thought I was going crazy. Now I have a name for this symptom set. That feels really good to know what it is. Now I can also find other people with a similar experience, draw support from them. That feels really good. If that seems like something that would be helpful for you, get that diagnosis. That being said, oftentimes a diagnosis comes with a whole lot of stigma. And since there isn't a cure and we know so little about it, it can sometimes harm more than it helps. So just being really thoughtful about getting diagnosed.
It's a double-edged sword because there are some programs and that are, government-funded programs and some government-funded compensation that you can only access with that diagnosis. Right. Exactly. And so, but then again, once you are diagnosed with dementia, that's not something that you're going to be able to just say, oh, I'm better now. It'll be there forever. And especially like people that get diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's, like in their 50s, I've encountered some individuals like that. And I'm just like, I mean, their lives are going back towards the beginning of the conversation, how, you're kind of, it's like overkill in terms of the level of independence is almost gone. And they're so young, but they have this diagnosis. They almost are put with a conservator. Their money, their rights, their ability to make decisions are taken away. And one of the biggest things that we don't necessarily that we haven't talked about really is the fact that once people do have a dementia or an Alzheimer's diagnoses, a lot of times they do have to have a conservatorship or a power of attorney, and that power of attorney can be financial or medical. So,
and they frequently get, I would say, imprisoned in memory care units, right? Get put behind locked doors. You get put into chemical restraints with antipsychotics. Exactly. So, yeah, it's very complicated, that diagnosis for sure.
Do you think that since more people are going to be aging in the United States than ever before in the history of our country, that this disease may become a little bit more prevalent? I'm sorry, this phenomenon may become a little bit more prevalent. Okay. I'm gonna get it right, and that it'll start to bring more awareness. Because I'll tell you, I've never really heard of ageism to the extent that I'm hearing it now. Yeah. And maybe it's because I'm talking to experts like you than I typically haven't in the past, but it's becoming a lot more commonplace for us to have a conversation about being ageist and the negative aspects of it. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. The demographic shifts are helping because there is a reality. I do think I always like to point out when we talk about longevity, because there's a lot of people that'll tell you like we're living longer because more of us are surviving childhood, not because we're getting better. So I feel like that's something I just want to make sure people know. It's not like we're getting really good at extending the end of life. We're getting really good at babies not dying. And that's why, so people have been living to the ages we're all living to for most of history, and then obviously having access to hygiene and stuff. So I think that's really important to name too, just as a general trend. We're doing really good with childhood illnesses. We're making headway on, later life illnesses, but it's slower. That being said too, as we're not dying of other things and we're living longer, that gives us more of an opportunity to experience dementia. So there is sort of this aspect of it, like because other things aren't getting us sooner, more people are living long enough to experience dementia. So absolutely, we're going to see more people living with it, not because there's more dementia out there, but because more people are surviving things that would have killed them before they experienced dementia.
So are there any current therapies or treatments that are available, and are they effective? Yeah.
So that I'm aware of, there's no medication that actually treats it. It's just symptom masking, which, as we talked about, is problematic because you're actually masking communication for the most part. That being said, anti-anxiety meds early on, help with anxiety early on can be really helpful because when we're anxious, I mean, you and I probably both know from our own experience, when you're really anxious, how well does your memory work? How well are your social skills? Right.
Not good.
So making sure we treat underlying anxiety and depression can help alleviate some symptoms, severity of symptoms. Again, my background is as a therapist, so I will say psychotherapy can be really helpful. In the early stages of dementia, you can still do traditional talk therapy, insight-based talk therapy can be really helpful to work through the grieving process of these changes. What are you losing? What are you gaining? In the middle stages of dementia, expressive arts practices can be really great, again, to foster that communication and that expression and giving us place for it to come out, so that it doesn't need to come out in these behaviors, we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And even in the very late stages of work, there's a field of psychotherapy called process work that does a lot of work with folks in comas and things too, that can be really helpful for connecting with people. I'm also an emerging thing that's happening. This is pretty cutting edge that I'm really curious about, is psychedelic assisted therapy, not for the person living with dementia, but for their care partners to help them have an experience of being in a different reality. Because so much of the experience of dementia is loosening the holds on time and space.
Interesting. Is it
I'm
working?
really excited about. Yes, so it is. It's for empathy increase, which then can help decrease frustration, which can increase quality of life for everyone. So I'm really, really curious as there's more legalization for those. So much of this is anecdotal now because it was being, having to be done.
Sure.
Obviously not in labs, but now that we've got some legalization around psychedelics, I'm super curious about that emerging work, as well as empathy builders. And then I'll also say, just if you're living with someone with dementia, go to an improv class. There's some really great work around techniques from improv being used to help increase well-being.
Interesting. When I think of... sometimes when I think of individuals who have a diagnosis of dementia, you ever seen Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix when Mad-Eye Moody is like at the very bottom of the chest? Or is it Goblet of Fire? Anyway, the one with Mad-Eye Moody.
Yeah.
And he's at the bottom of the chest and he's looking up and they're like, there you are at the very end of the movie. And I think to myself, like, if they're all the way down, somebody has dementia, it's all the way down in this chest, and they're looking up, and no one can see them and hear them, understand them, and then you bring in a psychedelic like psilocybin or, something like that, MDMA, and they escape their reality. It's almost like taking them out of that chest and putting them like. I'm so excited that you brought that up because I'm fascinated to see if that might have some significant, because it really doesn't it turn like different parts of your brain on?
Sort of all around, right? So I'd be really curious about it, just early stages to help people get comfortable with the bounds of reality being more fluid. And then empathy building for care partners, and then who knows, as a treatment, that would be really fascinating as well. So there's definitely some emerging work happening there, which is fascinating.
So cool. So before we wrap up, I want to talk about any resources or strategies for caregivers that you'd recommend and where those living with dementia and their loved ones can find community and support.
Absolutely. I have some great recs for you. So Dementia Action Alliance is an amazing organization to check out. There's also a coalition called Reimagining Dementia. That's, all of these include both people living with dementia and their care partners and advocates, the whole gamut. Dementia Friends is also a great program. Look up local memory cafes, which is just where folks can go and meet up in restaurants with other people living with dementia and care partners. Really great. I would say there's, the changingaging.org is a blog that has a bunch of, there'll be some links to stuff I've written for there, which is all sort of thinking about this more, not focusing on what's lost, but focusing on what's possible.
Absolutely.
I would say, and then the Eden Alternative is doing some amazing work in long-term care reform. And they just switched from, they have a membership model where individuals can join and really tap into community. So all of these that I just listed have, regular online Zoom gatherings, some in-person stuff. And I'll give links to all those so they can be included in this.
Amazing. So we always like to end the show with a call to action. What can we do to start building communities and a society more accepting and accessible to those with dementia?
Yeah, absolutely. In the absence of knowledge and a cure, the biggest thing that we can change is our reaction to dementia. We can reduce that suffering that comes from the culture that is so, anti-dementia. So, and to do that, I would just say educate yourself about the misconceptions of dementia, educate yourself about the stigma. And the best way to do that is to hang out with somebody living with dementia, because you're going to have all these ideas and you're going to meet this person and be like, whoa, it's not what I thought it was.